Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akriduluale. The headlines. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky vows to retake Ukrainian territories in Donbass and Crimea. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov claims that Russia's main goal in Ukraine is to protect the breakaway self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. And UN officials warn that the war in Ukraine risks plunging millions of people into food poverty across the globe. We begin this morning with information from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's traditional nightly address, where he vowed to, quote, liberate the Russian territory of Crimea and the independent republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. He was speaking just hours after reports of the Ukrainian military shelling residential buildings, a marketplace, and a maternity center in the center of Donetsk. Mr. Zelensky said last night that his army would defeat its Russian opponents in eastern Ukraine and recapture the cities of Mariupol, Kherson, and Melitopol from Russia and the DPR and LPR forces. During his speech, he also said Ukrainians have been paying, quote, a very high price in ongoing battles in the Donbass region, describing them as one of the most brutal battles in Europe and for Europe.
We will welcome to Kherson, and ordinary Kherson residents will meet our army on the streets of the city. We will come to Melitopol, and we will return all Melitopol residents the opportunity to live without fear. We will come to Mariupol, and we will liberate the city for the third time. We will come to Enahoda, and I want to repeat to everyone in the city who took to the streets against the Russian military, who refuses to cooperate with the occupiers, and who is waiting for us today. I want to repeat that we have not forgotten about our Enahoda for a day.
І це означає лише одне: Росія ще в червні може перетнути.
Meanwhile, Russia's RIA state news agency has cited Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov as saying that Russia's main goal in Ukraine is to protect the Moscow-backed republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. Mr. Peskov says in general, the protection of the republics is the main goal of the special military operation. Donetsk and Luhansk are two breakaway Russian-backed entities in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, which Russia says it is fighting to remove entirely from Kiev's control. And Russian Defense Ministry spokespersons at a press briefing say the armed forces have destroyed a large number of weapons and military equipment delivered to the Ukrainian forces by the United States and some European countries. Igor Konashenkov says the Russian forces also destroyed a temporary deployment site for foreign mercenaries. The head of the Luhansk Regional Military Administration, Sergei Hedha, says fighting in Severodonetsk continued overnight and Russian forces have taken control of a major part of the city.
High-precision air-based missiles near Udachna railway station in Donetsk People's Republic have destroyed a large number of weapons and military equipment delivered to a group of Ukrainian nationalists, including from the USA and European countries. In addition, temporary foreign mercenary deployment site near Fyodorovka, Lugansk People's Republic, and two batteries of multiple rocket launchers near Progress, Kharkov region, and Volchayarovka, Lugansk People's Republic have been destroyed.
Russia-backed separatist officials say that the death toll from yesterday's attacks on the Russian-backed self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic has grown to 5, while the number of injured has risen to 33. Separatist officials and Russian news agencies have reported several Ukrainian artillery strikes, including on a market. Russian news agencies later reported a shell had fallen on a maternity hospital in the city of Donetsk, triggering a fire and prompting staff to send patients to the basement. Earlier reports said 4 people died and 22 were injured. There's more on the situation in eastern Ukraine, the city of Severodonetsk, as the Luhansk governor has described it as extremely aggravated. Sergei Hedha wrote on Telegram that the storming of the city has been going on for several days in a row, and each day people are killed, but their bodies are difficult to reach due to the density of shelling. Mr. Haidar added that there are many damaged high-rise buildings in the old districts of Severodonetsk, some of which the Russian army shot to demolish the foundations. And satellite imagery from Maxar Technologies shows damaged bridges around the city of Severodonetsk. The images, which were released overnight, displayed a number of destroyed and damaged bridges which link Severodonetsk to the nearby towns of Rubinsk and Lysychansk. A Ukrainian official says that Russian forces cut off the last routes for evacuating citizens from Severodonetsk as the Kremlin pushed for victory in the Donbass region. The governor said the last bridge to the city was destroyed, trapping any remaining civilians and making it impossible to deliver humanitarian supplies, adding that 70% of the city was now under Russian control. Meanwhile, at least 3 people, including a child, have been killed and 4 injured today by what local separatist media say is a Ukrainian artillery strike on a market in Donetsk. Burning stores at the central Mesky market, and at least 1 body could be seen on the ground in Donetsk. Local news agency, the DAN, said 155mm caliber NATO standard artillery munitions hit parts of the region. Ukrainian officials have said an attack on a nearby residential block was carried out by the Russian military. President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly said the main immediate reason for what he casts as a special military operation was to protect the Russian speakers of the Donbass region from persecution and attack by Ukraine. Kiev says Russia's claim of persecution of Russian speakers is a baseless pretext for sending troops into the country. Staying in Ukraine, this video released by Ukrainian police today showed damage caused to residential buildings in the city of Bakhmut and other areas in Donetsk region following a Russian shelling. A resident in Bakhmut says the building he was in was shaking during Russian shelling, and footage showed shattered windows and scattered debris. A crater left by 1 shell in a road in Bakhmut was depicted in the images posted by the National Police of Ukraine. An unnamed officer said the police were documenting the consequences of the enemy's aggression. That's a quote. The province's news agency says at least 3 people, including a child, were killed and 4 injured yesterday by Ukrainian artillery at a market in the Russian-backed separatist Ukrainian region of Donetsk. Another report says calibers, which is a reference to standard artillery of NATO, hit parts of the region. The leader of the Russian-backed separatist Donetsk region of Ukraine, Denis Pushlin, says there are, quote, no grounds to pardon 2 British nationals and a Moroccan who were sentenced to death last week after being captured while fighting for Ukraine. A court in the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic had on Thursday found Britain's Aidan Aslin and Sean Pena and Moroccan Brahim Sadoun guilty of mercenary activities seeking to overthrow the republic. Britain says Aslin and Pena were regular soldiers and should be exempt under the Geneva Conventions from prosecution for participating in hostilities. The pro-Russian separatists who control Donetsk say they committed grave fines and have a month to appeal. Donetsk and Luhansk are 2 breakaway Russian-backed entities in the Donbass region, which Russia says it is fighting to remove from Kiev's control. United Nations Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet has spoken to the UN's Human Rights Council in Geneva about the havoc and destruction caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the consequential risks of plunging millions into poverty across the globe. According to the World Food Programme, the number of people living with severe food insecurity is expected to grow from 276 million at the start of 2022 to 323 million in the course of the year, with the poorest in society likely to suffer the most.
Strengthening fiscal systems can certainly help raise additional domestic resources in all countries. Finally, civic space, I wish to conclude on what I think is the most crucial and valuable element of building resilience in times of crisis. These are times for greater, not less, transparency and broader space for civic engagement and participation if we're serious about our commitments to build transformative and greener societies. A vibrant civic space is a lever of a stable, secure society. Yet we continue documenting attacks against defenders and journalists offline and online worldwide. We cannot separate progress on economic goals such as reducing poverty from the rights of those who are the intended beneficiaries of those developments, including the right of those people to be heard.
NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has hailed Sweden for taking important steps to meet Turkey's demands for approving Stockholm's NATO membership application. Sweden and Finland applied to join the alliance last month in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Their applications have faced unexpected opposition from Turkey, which has been angered by what it deems as Swedish support of Kurdish militants and by a previous decision to withdraw arms export licenses to Turkey. Swedish Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson says her country has changed its terrorism laws and is in the process of further tightening.
As you know, Turkey has raised concern in relations to Sweden's and Finland's applications, and we are taking them very seriously and have engaged in a dialogue together with Finland in order to find a way forward with Turkey.
I welcome that Sweden has already started to change its counter-terrorism legislation and that Sweden will ensure that the legal framework for arms export will reflect their future status as a NATO member with new commitments to allies. These are two important steps to address concerns Turkey has raised. The aim is to solve those issues as soon as possible, to be able to welcome Finland and Sweden as full members as soon as possible. Therefore, we are working hard and actively on these issues in close consultation with Stockholm, with Helsinki, and of course our NATO ally Turkey. And in that context, those signals from Sweden are important on terrorism and arms exports.
We have a much stricter regulation when it comes to financing of terrorism, and will also the 1st of July have even stronger legislation when it comes to the fight against terrorism. So here there are no questions about how strongly Sweden sees on terrorism, and that we are willing to contribute to the fight against terrorism.
If Sweden was attacked, then I deem it as unthinkable that NATO allies would not react. And that is a message that we have conveyed, the NATO allies have conveyed in a very clear way to any potential adversary. So seen from a security perspective, Sweden is in a better place now than before they applied. Then, of course, the aim is to, of course, take the next step, full membership, as soon as possible. But then we need to address the concerns expressed by Turkey. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Quite a lot of moving parts. Let's talk to former Vice Chancellor of the Adekunle Ajasin University, Akugba Akoko in Ondo State, and now at the Department of Political Science at the Obafemi Awolowo University in Ile-Ife, Professor Olufemi Mimiko. Good morning. Thank you for your time today.
Good morning, Ladi. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Good to see you once again.
My pleasure, too. Thank you.
Before we get to what's going on the ground, two things seem to have happened, which one could describe as seismic events, depending on which side you're on. The first is that there seems to be a realism, some pragmatism, if you like, coming into the discourse. Yesterday, you had the NATO Secretary General saying that, look, it's quite possible that Ukraine would have to make some compromises, including in terms of territory for peace, for this war to end. That seemed to have been a shift from the position all along.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much once again for having me. Good morning, listener. I think we come into the stark realities of this engagement. My position has always been that the most appropriate tool to deploy in trying to understand the nature of the ongoing conflict and the possible way out is the realist framework of analysis. Now, nobody is arguing that what Russia has done in Ukraine is good. Nobody is suggesting that the carnage, the level of destruction is tolerable. But you have to face the basic realities. in the realist perspective, we do not talk about moralism. We do not talk about admonitions. We speak concretely to facts on ground and what they suggest. A few months ago, I think a couple of months ago, perhaps the best non-realist scholar, Henry Kissinger, actually made this suggestion that we also had made much earlier, that the situation on ground is such that you cannot begin to hope that Ukraine will defeat Russia in this war, because Russia is a country that has a bigger military, that has nuclear weapons, that is directly share the same border with Ukraine. And so the only solution would be to recognize some of the claims that Russia has drummed up, including the possibility of ceding some territories to Russia. Now it's good that Henry Kissinger made the point 2 months ago publicly. Now the Secretary General of NATO is positively disposed to considering that. That, for me, is what needs to be done, such that this intolerable carnage, intolerable state of destruction, and the seismic implications for the global economy will have to be stanched, and we bring this crisis down. And I'd like to just add very quickly, moderator, that it's not going to be the first time in the international system that you have such concessions being made. As a matter of fact, in international relations, we talk about core and peripheral interests. Core interests are those interests that are so important that a nation will be willing to go to war to defend. But we also recognize that in some circumstances, you may even make some little concessions on your core interest in order to sustain the continued existence, one, of your country, and secondly, of your values. It's happened before. In the 19th century, for instance, Germany occupied Alsace-Lorraine, a territory belonging to France, and just after the Franco-Prussian War. It annexed Alsace-Lorraine in 1871 or so, in the 19th century. It wasn't until 1918, at the defeat of Germany in the First World War, that France was able to take back Alsace-Lorraine. And so you can make concessions now with a view to getting something back later. Look at Hong Kong. Hong Kong passed into Britain after the Opium War in the 19th century. Now, by 1997, China was good enough to make a reclaim on Hong Kong. And so what we think we need now, why not saying or suggesting that what Russia has done is agreeable? We must recognize that there's no chance for Ukraine winning this war. And the Americans are aware of this. What they try to do is to keep something on that will bleed Russia, if you will, to death. And so the most appropriate and reasonable thing, which I think every person that is genuinely concerned with the level of destruction, should be to persuade Ukraine to make some concessions. Now that you make the concessions today does not suggest that in 10, 20, 50 years, you could not be strong enough to say, no, I want my land back. That is the realistic path to take. And I think it's good that NATO Secretary General is himself now talking in that regard. Thank you.
All along, there have been people who had made this suggestion, as you said. Dr. Henry Kissinger is probably the most prominent, and he was talked down. At the time he said it, the Ukrainians talked him down. But in terms of the realities of things as they are now, Ukraine, fortunately or unfortunately, does not appear that it will be able to take this decision, because it is now being guided, as some would say, by the Western allies, the likes of the United States, whom you mentioned, Britain, France, Germany, all those who are giving it weapons and who are packaged aid for it. Do you think that outside influence on the decision that should ordinarily be Ukraine's will complicate things and may prevent the pragmatism and the realism that you have talked about?
Yes, it's obviously complicating it. And that's why I also talk about Zelensky's purchase on statecraft without any offense meant. I make the point, and I have published on this just immediately after the war broke out, that you don't have the requisite experience on the part of Zelensky to deal with a situation of this nature. And I made the point that look at some of his assumptions. He assumed that the Americans would put boots on ground. He assumed that the West would declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine. He assumed that whatever the sophistication of the weapons he wanted would be supplied. These are things that the West will not give. And I'm saying that to all intents and purposes, again, without any offense meant, this is not to suggest that Ukraine is not hurting, but the truth is that Ukraine, in this situation, is simply a pawn on the chessboard of global powers. And it's unfortunate that Zelensky does not recognize this. As Austin Peters made, the point in a visit to, I think, Poland or so a few months ago, and I think, again, Wale, the Deputy Treasury Secretary, Wale Adeyemo, that the entire purpose of the United States in this war is to get Russia to stop playing global responsibilities and projecting global power. And so it's not about Ukraine, fundamentally. And so this perspective, this global interplay, this geopolitical dimension to the thing is making it more complicated. If you look at the Western media, for instance, you don't hear anybody talking about an alternative vision in Ukraine about this war. All you hear, all you are given is what the official mainstream perspective that this war must be fought to an end. We must find a way to defeat Russia and all of that. I'm sure there are perspectives within Ukraine that will be realistic enough to say, come off it, let's make some concessions and end this destruction of our country that is going on unabated. And so, as you said, I think the position of the West complicates this matter. And I think it's important for Zelensky and the political leadership in Ukraine to find a way to save their country. The level of destruction that is going on is scary. Nowadays, it is said that Ukraine loses about 100 to 200 soldiers every day. It requires about 7 billion on a monthly basis to run its affairs. This is not something you allow to happen to your country for any reasons. And so I think the onus is on the Americans and the Western Alliance to find a way to encourage Zelensky to make the requisite concession that need to be made for this war to come to an end. It's a fact, it's something that will remain forever in the realm of idealism to assume that Ukraine will defeat Russia in a war of this nature. It's not going to happen. And so make the concessions that are necessary to save your people from this level of destruction, and then you can begin to move forward thereafter. That is my proposition. I made this point on February 25, a day after the war broke out, as you said, because Henry Kissinger is a big guy in terms of the realist perspective. It's good that he made the point, and it's good also that NATO is considering that. I think that is a reasonable path to go.
Indeed. Professor Olufemi Mimiko, it's always a pleasure to have you and your perspective on the program. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
After the break, more weapons. Poland wants new weapons after arming Ukraine. Details in a moment. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. All three indexes in the United States stock market closed in the red yesterday as the U.S. continued support for the war in Ukraine and battles with many economic challenges. Our Washington correspondent Maria Bird has more on this and other top trends in the U.S. as it relates to this war.
As Russia increases its airstrikes on Ukraine this week, the U.S. continues to support Ukraine through military aid and providing warships to Poland, a neighboring country to Ukraine and a NATO member. The U.S. has been very clear that they will support Ukraine, but will only provide military personnel to NATO allies.
A destroyer from the U.S. Navy being in the port of Gdynia, I assure you of that. It's meant to send a clear message to the people of Poland that we stand with you, that you are safe and that you are secure. As President Biden said, the U.S. and NATO will defend every square inch of NATO territory. Poland is a frontline state to the crisis in Ukraine. We are protecting on this flank the transatlantic community against what President Putin has unleashed in a homicidal, brutal way in Ukraine.
While the U.S. and NATO continue to support the war, the world economy and specifically the U.S. economy's access to food supply are suffering greatly.
We're looking at not just a domestic, but a global issue with food supply. And this stems right, and the president's been forthright about this, this stems right out of the conflict where Russia has invaded the sovereign nation of Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is one of the world's important producers of wheat and grain and corn. And so that threatens the global supply. And what this president told the American people is that we're going to do everything we can, of course, to support our allies in this unjust and unprovoked war, but also to help the American consumer.
As the White House leads the efforts for Western support of Ukraine, there are other major domestic challenges that President Biden and his advisors must address, such as inflation, food security, and economic access for the most vulnerable Americans. From Washington, Maria Bird, Channel Television News.
Let's now talk to Maria in a bit more detail. She joins us virtually from Washington. Morning, Maria.
Morning.
In your report there, I had to take a double take because I saw some empty shelves. Not usually a picture that comes out of the United States. How bad is the situation in terms of food supply and supply chain disruptions?
Food supply, unfortunately, in the U.S. for the first time in, I would say, decades, or as long as some people can even remember within their lifetime, is a major issue. Now, is it to the point where people cannot find any food? No, we're not at that point. But it's just some of the food that you're typically able to purchase on a very regular basis is not there. Sometimes stores will go weeks, and in some cases almost a month or more without having certain foods. The real issue, one of the major issues has been really food supply for babies. We've had a major, as you all have probably heard, a major shortage on formula. We've also had shortages on various hygiene products. And so the shortage is one, it's really a supply and chain demand issue. But you can only imagine that in some of the smaller grocery stores, some small towns in the U.S. where they don't have access to much, even without having a food shortage, that those environments are really suffering greatly because you only have a limited number of supply in many smaller rural environments.
Well, the last time that we spoke to you, the last two times actually that we've spoken to you, one of the major subjects of discussion was the rise in prices, especially of energy. Has that abated somewhat?
No, we're actually expecting tomorrow, or on Wednesday, tomorrow, that the Federal Reserve will have a heavy increase on interest rates because inflation is so high. Even though the market was telling us and people were saying, well, people are still buying, retail is still prospering. But the challenge is that we're seeing that people are going into their savings. People are also using a lot of credit to purchase things. And so that tells many economists that does not mean that people are able to afford some of the high prices. And so the Federal Reserve could be raising interest rates to the highest they've been since the early 1990s. And so that aggressive approach could have a dramatic impact on the economy, which then could lead to potential recession discussions, I think, within many Americans.
Well, all of this is happening at the same time that domestically, America is faced with some very significant issues that it's trying to deal with. Stricter gun control, especially in the aftermath of the recent mass shootings, and then the run-up to the midterm elections, which are in November, and all the hullabaloo about whether or not there's need for more stimulus and all that is going on pari passu with this. How complicated do you think this is going to get?
It's extremely complicated. We're right now waiting on Senate and the House of Representatives to put forth the bill as it relates to gun violence, looking at being able to raise the age of the minimum age to purchase a gun from 18 to 21. That's a huge bill that is expected to pass the House, but it's questionable whether or not it will pass the Senate, despite, as you said before, the increase in mass shootings. We've seen some just in the past few days, and so it's not ending here in the U.S. as it relates to mass shootings, but yet and still there's still a major political crisis and still a major political tug of war, to be very honest, as it relates to gun control control laws. And that's just the beginning. People are wondering and asking for background checks and whether or not the president is going to be willing to even put a moratorium on gun purchases in the U.S. Those are all major questions that are being looked into. We already know just yesterday there were 31 white nationalists arrested in Idaho that were planning some sort of plot in the downtown area during the Pride community parades. And so we're seeing that the U.S. is escalating in this area, but yet and still there's still some great political challenges. And as you said, the midterm elections, we're already seeing some of these elections occurring. You know, South Carolina is in the midst of that. And so many states are preparing themselves for what their next leaders will look like. And will it be, you know, especially with the Republican Party, will it be those who are supporting former President Trump, or will it be those of the original Republican Party, those who don't have some of the same MAGA philosophies? But we know the former president has been very vocal over the past few weeks and few months, and we believe that he will continue to be vocal and continue to have those supporters behind him, especially supporting those candidates that follow and that he has endorsed.
I'm happy you mentioned the former president, Donald Trump, because the next question I was going to ask you is that another issue that seems to be taking everybody's attention, particularly in the United States, away from the war in Ukraine and its consequences, is the Capitol Hill January 6 insurrection hearings, which are also going on, and that is generating a great deal of controversy and attention. As a matter of fact, would it be safe to say that all the major political actors are deeply involved in that, possibly with the exception of President Biden? Although, because President Trump has asked the Russians to release all the damaging information they have about President Biden, he's been drawn into it.
You're exactly correct. I would say that the number one news story right now in the U.S. are the hearings. Not only are they the number one news story, they are being watched by the majority of Americans each and every day. The hearings are very much, I think, hitting home to many Americans. I think it's having people relive what it was like to live through that day on January the 6th. It's also exposing some real information, and it's giving people insight into really what was happening and what was occurring as it relates to what former President Trump was instructing not only his followers, but also instructing his staff. We know that just yesterday, the former Attorney General Barr was releasing information and providing the committee with insight into things that I think, if we were talking about this a year ago, he would not have been as comfortable with releasing. But many of those realities and the facts are really leading back to potentially stating that former President Trump was inciting this, and that there could be some very strong legal ramifications around it. And so we can expect to continue to see that. The question, though, is going to be, what will this mean moving forward? And will this impact the former president's ideas around running again in the next upcoming presidential elections?
My final question to you this morning, Maria, would be that all what we've talked about, the January 6 hearings, the rising prices of foodstuff and energy, and then the midterm elections and all of that, are they having some impact, do you think, on Americans' attention to what is going on in Ukraine and their support for the position the government has taken?
Well, Americans have traditionally been one of the leading humanitarians across the world. And so I think that many Americans are still very much in support of the war. They know what's at stake globally. I think Americans, more so than they ever have before, are understanding that the world is interconnected, and that America cannot exist without the interconnection of the rest of the world. And so they are in support of the war, but they are obviously very challenged, as you said, with all of the things that are happening in the U.S. and many domestic challenges that exist. But they do understand that in order for things to improve domestically, now even more than it was 10, 15, or 20 years ago when we went through some recession-type challenges, it's important that globally we're able to participate and be able to ensure the health of the global economy, and obviously looking at what's happening with the war to support it in the way in which will be best for the greater world.
Indeed, Maria, thank you for the reporting this morning, and do continue to stay safe. Maria Bird, our correspondent in Washington. Polish President Andrzej Duda has told his army commanders that the country's weapon stocks have been left too bare by military aid to Ukraine, and the country wants its Western allies to replace the firepower that was shipped to Kiev. He added that Poland has been Ukraine's top supplier of heavy weapons, including hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, and other gear. The aid also included hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition, as well as drones and anti-aircraft launchers. Mr. Duda says Warsaw moved quickly to meet neighbor Ukraine's needs on the battlefield, providing about $1.7 billion in military aid alone after Russia launched its military offensive in February. According to him, it could take years to replace such weaponry. Poland has been a leading proponent of punishing Russia through sanctions and giving Ukraine advanced weaponry to fend off its offensive. And Colombia is set to increase coal and petroleum production as it steps up to fill the void created by sanctions against Russia, and that's according to Energy Minister Diego Mesa. Mesa says on the sidelines of Canada's Prospectors and Developers Conference in Toronto that the Andean country has restarted coal exports to Ireland. Ireland stopped buying Colombian coal in 2016 on the basis of human rights concerns. And the European Commission has approved a €500 million scheme to support companies active in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The scheme was approved under the State and Temporary Crisis Framework adopted by the Commission on the 23rd of March 2022, which recognizes that the EU economy is experiencing serious disturbance. The Commission adopted the State and Temporary Crisis Framework to enable member states to use the flexibility foreseen under the state and rules to support the economy in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The €500 million scheme will be open to companies of all sizes and active in all sectors affected by the current geopolitical crisis and the related sanctions, with the exception of the financial, primary, agricultural, aquaculture, and fisheries sectors. Let's talk about this a bit and some of the other developments in the world of business as it relates to the war in Ukraine with Ini John McWa of our business desk. Good morning, Ini.
Good morning.
We're ahead in this one because we already were helping our companies in Nigeria with some help. Not about Ukraine though, but with some help before this. Stop that. I'm saying that we were, but this one is new.
Yes, it is. Well, it is new in this context. This is for Finland, for corporates in Finland. But this is a program that started during COVID. So the EU, they have like a special fund for member states to help corporates who were affected. You know, a lot of buffer then. I mean, as you said, Nigeria did try it. So this is to help some companies who've been affected, the high cost in energy. As I heard you speak with Maria there, what's going on in the US. And in the US, they're touting removing gas tax. We don't know how far they will go with that, but that's one of the things they want to do. So this is to help corporates, you know, like that, who have been affected by energy costs, supply chain disruption, which has really hiked operational costs, you know. And also, like in Nigeria, what corporates are doing is to increase their inventories. So they're buying raw materials ahead, you know. So of course that is increasing their costs for today, but they're hoping it will help. They will make it up for tomorrow. So this €500 million is supposed to help corporates in Finland to do that. And also something related to this is what Ukraine is doing. They have started a new economic strategy, 6 points, that is going to have grants and duties and tax-free, especially for startups, IT companies, and they're talking about post-war recovery. I don't know how realistic that is, since we are still in the middle of the war. Perhaps they have a plan, but I guess they are looking beyond and also looking at sustaining the country, even in the midst of the war. Because if Russia, I think Russia is considered about 20% of the country now, but perhaps they are saying, okay, the other parts of the country should, keep sustaining itself. We had discussing with Australia and some other countries about finding other routes, to pass their grains through. So these are just plans by EU and Ukraine to sustain the country in the midst of the war and possibly post-war.
All right, Ine, stay with me. We're due for a break. We'll discuss the other points when we return. Plus, Pope Francis says he will not reduce the complexity of the war to a distinction between good and bad. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned and welcome back. Ine is still with me, and Ine, there seems to be, of course, we've reported this super yachts moving, aircraft running to safe havens, but the people themselves are leaving.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is not just about people fleeing from the war in Ukraine, from Ukraine, or those leaving Russia because of the sanctions. Countries like the United States and Britain are also feeling the pinch this time. Millionaires are relocating because there's been, of course, inflation is everywhere. So central banks are hiking interest rates and taxes are coming on. We talked about the windfall tax in the UK. It's also going on in Germany. It's also a conversation going on. That means the rich people are going to get taxed even more. So millionaires are looking for tax haven. And they're going to countries like Australia, Singapore, Israel, Switzerland, Malta. But guess what? Top on that list is Monaco, a country that a lot of people will not think about, because in Monaco, there's no personal income tax, there's no capital gains tax, there's no property tax, there's only 1% on rental tax annually. So why won't you go there?
So we might have an influx of people in there.
Yes, and we don't know how things would change there if you have an influx, because by the end of this year, it's expected that about 15,000 millionaires would have left Russia, 2,008 would have left Ukraine, Britain would have lost 1,005, as well as the United States would have lost 1,005. So if all those people leave with their money to these countries, I guess those countries will be in for...
There'll be a boom time for them.
Yeah, and I think every day it just shows that the war is creating a new global trend, and even before the war ends, we might see a whole lot of things changing. We've talked about the dollar losing its dominance. We are now seeing millionaires relocating to UAE, to Australia, and some countries that you never thought of. Because Monaco used to have the problem of people will stay there and work in the UK, for instance, So now, because they do have a law or policy, if you stay there for 3 months, you are regarded as a resident. So that means you don't pay all of these taxes. So why won't you move there? So it's really creating a new world order.
Talking about a new world order, I was reading somewhere where it said that just before the war in Ukraine started, Bitcoin was $61,000. And as at yesterday, it had dropped below $24,000.
Yeah, in fact, I think yesterday evening it was about 23,000. Just before I came in, myself and Ladi were talking about it, and the fear has gone to about 8 over 100. So it's a new world order, but Ladi, because he's a crypto person, so he's saying, well, let's also look at the equities market. The Nasdaq is falling,
which is what Maria was reporting.
So I don't know, things are changing, but not changing for good. We see in most cases, and it's a scary one. It's a scary one for the world. Maria was telling you about how they're going to hike interest rates again.
Indeed.
And what it does to the economy, what it does to investment, what it does to the ordinary man. If yesterday with Juliana, we're talking about the new high in petrol price, 187 pence for 1 liter.
Yeah.
You know, and I watched some interviews in the United States where people did not go out of their houses because they were calculating, you know,
how much it will cost them.
To cost. If you don't go out of your house, how do you make money? How do you live? You know, it's
tough. It's tough. And speaking of tough, India says it is likely to allow wheat exports to Indonesia. I remember that at the point we discussed that India put a ban on all wheat exports because they wanted to keep for their own people.
To satisfy the local demands. Well, because you can't eat only wheat.
you need other things.
Exactly. Yes. Palm oil is one of their own staples, so that they use for cooking and everything and all that. And Indonesia had also done the same thing for palm oil for their country, but they had said theirs is for 3 weeks. So they're supposed to start exporting palm oil, but they have so many rules now that it's almost as if they are not exporting. So they are trying to strike a deal with India. You know, there's B2B, business to business. Now it's more of government to government.
G to G.
G to G. So they're trying to have that kind of arrangement where wheat can go for palm oil, since they have excess of this and this ones have excess of this, so both countries can enjoy. And India seems to be making the most of this. Remember, some time ago we talked about what they're doing with Russia.
Indeed.
Fertilizer. So Russia gives them fertilizer, they do the planting and then sell the products to Russia. Another G to G. So the new world order is not, maybe it's not all negative. People are looking for smart ways, or countries are looking for smart ways to meet up with local demands and sustain their country, sustain their population. I mean, I have to take it home and say I do hope that Nigerian government is also looking, you know.
You took that right out of my mouth, because that was going to be the final point I was going to make.
I mean, we can't leave home. We can just talk about other countries. We are here. I mean, when we leave here, we go to the filling station to fill our cars, or to the market to buy a loaf of bread. We feel the pinch also, and we really do hope that, you know,
the lessons are being learned and more importantly are being implemented.
Exactly.
Thank you, Ini. There'll be more of this on the business programs right after this show, and then later on at 1:30, so you can join Ini and Ladi for that. Moving on, in Ukraine's Mykolaiv region, crops of sunflower and wheat are ready to be harvested, but following Russia's invasion, local farmers are scrambling to come up with a plan to survive a harvest under Russian fire. The country is seeking ways to get grain and vegetable oils out of the country, but the war has halted Kiev's Black Sea grain exports, causing widespread shortages and soaring prices, with Russian bombs not only damaging infrastructure, but also the local agri-food sector. Vladimir Onchuk owns a 2,000 hectare farm that ships its grains through Mykolaiv port. His wheat and sunflower crops are ready for harvest, but his farmers are afraid to drive their tractors over the remains of Russian munitions scattered in the fields. Western countries have accused Russia of creating the risk of global farming by shutting Ukraine's Black Sea ports, like the port city of Mykolaiv, home to one of Ukraine's largest agricultural commodity terminals. But as efforts to unblock Ukrainian exports are underway, the farmers hope the international community will help them. Pope Francis says he will not reduce the complexity of the war to a distinction between good and bad. He was quoted as saying this in an article in the Italian daily newspaper La Stampa when asked whether he's in favor of Russia's President Vladimir Putin. He goes on to say he hopes to meet Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church in September in Kazakhstan. Pope Francis is also reported as saying Russia's use of mercenaries in Ukraine, including Chechens and Syrians, is monstrous. He describes Russian troops as ferocious and cruel, adding that Ukrainians are fighting for survival. A Ukrainian photographer has used the widespread destruction in the eastern city of Chernihiv as a stark, sobering background for school students graduating amidst the ongoing conflict with neighboring Russia. Photographer Stanislav Senik's graduation album photographs show students wearing graduation sashes while surrounded by debris, posing in heavily damaged buildings or standing atop destroyed tanks and vehicles. Senik set out to document the story of the graduating classes of 2022 and depict the reality that school children faced during the war in Ukraine. Senik, who worked as a photographer for 5 years, says the school children no longer showed shock about their decimated surroundings and had likely grown stronger from the experience. His photographs show school students embracing next to mangled metal and posing on a tank as they don graduation sashes. Senik said the photographs will be compiled into a graduation album for the students and hopes to find an exhibition of auction where he can showcase and sell the photos and donate the money raised to the Ukrainian armed forces. In the sports news emanating from all of this, World Anti-Doping Agency WADA has revealed that they are keeping an open line of communication with Russia despite the invasion of Ukraine to ensure that it did not give a free pass to cheats. Most Russian athletes are currently banned from competitions because of the war, but the country's anti-doping efforts are continuing to be monitored.
The anti-doping system is still operating in Russia. I mean, obviously the war is in Ukraine, not in Russia, so they still are able to go and test the athletes, and they are able to ship the sample out of Russia, in particular to Turkey, because there are still flights, regular flights, and they've been able also to transfer the money so that they can pay the laboratory and so on. So there's still an ongoing anti-doping program currently in Russia, and we've also encouraged International Federation to organize and continue having Russian athletes as part of their testing pool, even so they are not competing currently in their sports, because as the person who wrote the question right, we all hope this war will end, and sooner rather than later. So it's important that they keep having that.
All right, thanks for staying tuned. That's our show this morning. My name is Ladi Akeredoluale. Do join us for an update within the world today at 5 p.m. And the show is back tomorrow at 9. Do go out there and have yourselves a good Tuesday ahead. Good morning.